Well, two young Earth creationists, they've decided to take a crack at explaining the massive dinosaur footprint site in Bolivia. And one of those young Earth creationists has responded directly to me and my challenge. Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back. A month ago, I made a video about what I thought is one of the most spectacular dinosaur track sites ever discovered, the Crocus Pampa track site in Bolivia. Over 16,000 individual dinosaur footprints, more than 1,300 separate trackways, hundreds of swim tracks, bird prints, tail drag marks, all of these wonderfully preserved in extraordinary detail in rocks dated to about 66 million years ago, or just a blink of the eye before maybe a large rock struck the earth. So from the original publication, this is the site we're talking about. In the foreground here, right behind me here, on some exposed rock levels, there are, as I said, thousands and thousands of footprints. And this is just in the very small percentage of region that is where that particular rock layer is exposed. And so if you'd watched my previous video, we talked about the fact that there's probably hundreds of thousands of dinosaur footprints actually preserved in this basin. And I'm showing this picture also to remind you that there are thousands of feet of rock that were potentially above this particular area that you see today that's been eroded. And what's not seen are the thousands of feet of rock that's below it. That's going to be relevant for our discussion of how young Earth creationists have responded to the origins and development, or I would say like how these particular footprints were preserved for us today. But you might recall from my previous video that one of the other big surprises wasn't just the footprints themselves. It was who actually discovered them. The lead researchers of this particular study were funded by the Geoscience Research Institute. Now, the GSI, if you're not familiar with it, is the scientific arm of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And this organization is a heavily young Earth creationist leaning organization. And yet, the published paper, this paper that I'm showing you right here, all right, is published in a secular journal. It's full of Cretaceous dates, paleo-environmental reconstructions of what the environment looked like at the time that these footprints were laid down, descriptions of organisms living in a really stable coastal environment over long extended periods of time. There's not a whisper, as we noted, of any creationist flood geology anywhere in this paper. I argued in my video that this creates a really interesting tension. Here you have young Earth creationists who were in the field collecting data, reporting on it honestly. As far as I can tell, this is excellent work. But the results directly contradict. In my mind, we'll see about the young Earth creationists who respond to this particular research and try to put it in the perspective of young Earth creationism in a moment. But in my mind, it directly contradicts the flood geology model that some of the authors, we'll see that not all the authors of this paper, but at least some of them, very important members of this research group, were theologically committed to a flood geology and a young Earth. Well, since that particular video, as I said before, two creationists have responded, and they've responded in print. And these responses, they really couldn't be much more different from each other. Other than the fact they're both young Earth creationists, about everything else about their response is utterly different. One, which we'll look at first, is by Dr. Timothy Clary at the Institute for Creation Research. And the other is by Christian Ryan at the New Creation blog. So I want to walk you through both of these responses and compare how they handle the evidence, how they respond to how these footprints got here, at this location, embedded in this rock. And let's talk about the differences and what between their responses, and maybe a little bit about what that tells us about young Earth creationism and how young Earth creationists communicate science to its audience. All right, first up, we've got Dr. Timothy Clary, who is a geologist by training. Clary says the flood, of course, explains everything that's reported in this paper. His article is titled, "The Flood Explains 18,000 Dinosaur Tracks in Bolivia." And it appears on the Institute for Creation Research website around January 22nd this year, 2026. It's a relatively short piece, only about 800 words or so. Now, I was clued into the fact that he was going to respond. to this particular site. Not necessarily to me, although there was a commenter on my previous video that I made early January. And somebody commented on my blog, on my YouTube channel, saying that they had heard that Dr. Clary was going to respond to this particular evidence. Now, I don't know if they were suggesting that he was going to respond to me and my, discussion about these particular tracks, but he was going to at least respond to this particular paper. And indeed, he finally did. And I got to tell you, incredibly disappointing. All right. It's just, I don't know how else to put it, but this is like, I'll say it. This is a kind of an embarrassing response. It certainly doesn't take into account anything that I said. And it certainly isn't responding to any of my criticisms and my challenges. That's for sure. Whether he's aware of them or not. I'm assuming he was, but just we'll grant that maybe he didn't see my response at all. And all he did was read the paper, and he's reporting on the results of the paper to his young Earth creationist audience and trying to put the results of the paper in a perspective for them. It's still embarrassing. All right. I mean, it's still not a very, I guess 800 words wasn't enough, but he certainly short shrifted the actual research. Now, let's just get right into it. His basic argument goes something like this. He says that dinosaurs at the site were fleeing rising floodwaters near the end of Noah's flood. This is the typical boilerplate response to really all footprints in the fossil record. Animals were running around chaotically, running away from floodwaters. So they're just like bolting away from where they see danger. And the danger would be massive tsunamis that were generated by all this tectonic activity. And the oceans, therefore, are convulsing. And they're throwing up water and sediments onto land. And then between these tsunami waves, somehow the dinosaurs that had somehow survived at this point, even though there's thousands of feet of sediment below them, which had to have been deposited at some point during the flood, these dinosaurs came to be on top of all these sediments, and they wade across the fresh limestone surface, leaving their walking tracks behind. Then, as the story goes, the next flood came through, or the next tsunami wave came through, and the dinosaurs were forced to swim. And they just kept trying to head toward higher ground. But eventually the floodwaters overcome them because, of course, all the dinosaurs died in the flood. Well, except the ones on the ark. Now, on the surface of it, that's a really dramatic and, to, I think, some people, some of his audience, a compelling story. They can kind of like visualize that. Dinosaurs running away from the flood. And as they do so, very quickly their footprints get covered up by the next wave. And somehow that then preserves them and it eventually turns into rock, and then we're seeing it today. Now, the problem is that all of this is almost entirely contradicted by the evidence of the paper he's actually citing and covering. All right, so what does Dr. Clary get wrong? I've got a little bit of his piece on the screen here, but let's look at a couple different points. First, one of the really big ones for me, and it's not really the sciencey portion of it, like not the actual physical evidence about dinosaur fossils themselves. But Clary never tells his audience in these 800 words that the researchers who published this paper are themselves young Earth creationists. Now, as we'll see in a moment, when we look at the New Creation blog piece about this, we're going to learn that not all the authors are young Earth creationists. It's kind of a mix of both. But nonetheless, really the lead author, young Earth creationist. That seems like a notable thing. And it seems like something you'd be proud of as a young Earth creationist. Dr. Clary is a young Earth creationist. Some of these authors who did this research and published this paper are young Earth creationists. Why not celebrate young Earth creationist legitimate research in a secular journal, acknowledged under peer review as being good work? Why not do that? I mean, think about the Geoscience Research Institute funded this work. All right? They funded the research. So these are people that share Clary's theological commitments about a young Earth, global flood, and yet they went to the field, reported what they found. They described in entirely conventional terms, 66 million years old, a lake margin environment, dinosaurs living normally across extended periods of time. That's all described in the paper. That's a hugely significant fact for a young Earth audience, his audience, to understand and know. Clary just doesn't even mention it. He just treats the paper as another piece of secular science that he needs to reinterpret for his audience. I think the reason's pretty clear. If he tells his audience that fellow young Earth creationists produced the work, then he has to explain why those creationists describe the evidence in terms that completely contradict flood geology. And that's a pretty uncomfortable conversation, potentially. It's just easier to skip it, which is what he did. And this isn't the first time this has happened in young Earth creationist literature. The same Geoscience Research Institute team was instrumental in describing that famous fossil site in Peru I mentioned in my last video. That was also a young Earth paleontological contribution. It was widely covered, probably more so than even this article in the popular science media. And when other young Earth organizations referred to that particular paper, which they did because it was covered in the media, they felt like they had to respond. They talked about those whale fossils. And what did they do? They never mentioned that it was funded. The research itself was funded by a young Earth creationist organization. So there's a pattern here. And Clary is falling into that pattern once again. All right, second thing. Tsunamis. Oh, let's get to the science here. Clary's tsunami scenario just doesn't match the evidence at all. He says these tracks were made between tsunami waves, but the paper describes ripple marks from gentle, shallow water wave action, not tsunami surges. I can't remember if I pointed it out, but in this image right here, you can see that limestone up here. Here's this limestone. Here's a couple deep footprints. All right, so that limestone was pretty soft at the time that dinosaur walked across there. But you can see on the surface, I don't know how clear it is to you, but on the surface there's these ripple marks. All right, these are very, very small ripple marks. All right, that's indicative of shallow water with slightly, with some motion of water moving back and forth. And then you also have swim tracks. Right, swim tracks are where an animal is swimming. All right. And maybe just their feet are barely touching the ground. Just give them a little bit of push off. All right. And so you're going to have these just like maybe little toe tracks. And that's actually what you do see in some of these places. You actually like the toe marks. Right. So not the whole foot setting down into the sediment. Right. That's going to be a shallow, quiet environment, not a tsunami. Okay. Tsunami-driven water would then obliterate the tracks, even if those tracks could have been made at that particular moment in time. So you can't have it both ways. You can't invoke tsunamis and then explain the preservation of the most delicate trace fossils at the site. So between the walking tracks and the swim tracks, there's also a thin layer containing a whole bunch of different gastropod shells. Right? There's actually multiple levels in which these tracks are found. And then you have this layer of gastropod shells. Well, these snails had to accumulate at the surface after this water rose. All right. So what the idea is you have like some estuary or some small lakes, and the water rises, the water goes down, there's mud, dinosaurs walk across, the water rises again, but not in a violent way. All right. It just rises up. You then have those tracks there at the bottom. And then you have snails in the water, and they're accumulating on the surface, and then eventually get covered over with mud when the water rises again and sediment comes in, fills that in, and then you have another layer of mud after it dries up somewhat, and dinosaurs walk on it again. All right? This all is indicative of time passage, not immediate boom, boom, boom events one after another, like in this tsunami scenario. Right? That doesn't just happen in a couple minutes or even a couple days or really even a couple of months. We're talking about years probably at many of these locations, if not decades and hundreds of years being exposed. All right, number 3. Clary claims that dinosaurs were heading toward higher ground. Right? That's always the mantra. The dinosaurs and other animals are fleeing the flood, and that's why dinosaur tracks seem to be always heading in one particular direction. Well, at least they say that they were there. But in this paper itself, the one he's talking about, it specifically shows that trackways run parallel to the ripple marks. The ripple marks would be where the water is coming in and out, all right, creating ripples, horizontal ripples, right? And they're parallel to the shore, right? The dinosaur tracks then are mostly running along a shoreline, which would make sense. You have a lake, you have a body of water, you've got this muddy mud flat near it, and they're meandering along there. They're not running away from the water. They're running parallel to it. That's the opposite of what Clary suggests, and the opposite of what the authors are actually reporting. Some of the tracks show turns. One of them shows a U-turn, meandering, crisscrossing across each other. This is not what a bunch of panicked animals that are all running away from some extreme danger are going to do. Also, fourth, Clary doesn't say anything about what I've called the mud problem, and others have been noting. There's meters thick layers of really fine-grained mudstone above these fossils, right? We know they're above the fossils because this is eroded limestone, and above that there's mudstone in the surrounding area. And that mudstone, and there's mudstone below these surfaces. Mudstone's made of extremely fine particles. And you can't just, in a large flood, lay out thick layers of mud that's consolidated. It's going to be really squishy. It's mostly water, right? It takes time for the water to actually settle out and move out and allow the particles to consolidate, compact. All right. So deposit 3 meters of mudstone catastrophically in hours or days. Yes, a lot of mud could be deposited. I mean, you've seen floods where you have a lot of mud. Also, you don't want to go walking out in that mud or you'll end up hip deep in it. Dinosaurs, and some of these were large dinosaurs because these are very large footprints, weighing, a ton or more. They couldn't possibly walk on a fresh deposit of a meter or two of mud, lest they would be a meter or two down in the mud up to their bellies. And that's not what the footprint suggests. The footprint suggests that they could hold up, that this mud, this limestone, this limey material could hold up the weight of these large dinosaurs. That would take time, potentially many, many years, in order to consolidate that thick of a layer of mud. So the firmness requires all this. You have to extract the water. You have to dewater all of that, and that takes time. Now, Clary's article ends with a statement that is particularly galling, really. It's in blue right here behind me, if you haven't already noticed it. He says, deliberately ignoring the global flood that occurred about 4,500 years ago leads to great confusion and fictional stories. Believing in the truth of God's word resolves many apparent mysteries and leads to clarity and salvation through Jesus. Right? He's saying that the authors of this paper are deliberately ignoring the global flood. They didn't use the flood as an explanation. Again, does he know? Does Tim? I actually wondered about this in my last video. Does Tim Clary and will other young Earth creationists even recognize that the main author of this article is young Earth creationist? And by saying this, is he saying that is he accusing that particular author of just ignoring the global flood? What Tim Clary is doing is ignoring the evidence from the paper. And he is definitely not bringing the evidence, the observation. He believes in observational science, right? He's not even bringing the observations that these authors made to his audience. He's obscuring the observations and sometimes lying about them. Dinosaurs aren't running away from the flood. They're running in parallel to where the water is. All right, that second sentence here, believing the truth of God's word resolves the many apparent mysteries. He didn't really even present many mysteries in his little article here. He barely presented the things in the article as mysteries. He kind of cherry-picked the things that kind of already sounded floodish, right? So I don't know, a younger creationist reading that article are like, I don't really see that many mysteries. It's like, yeah, okay, some of the stuff's not, really clear, and you help clear it up for me. But if you really read the article, you'd be hit with some much more profound mysteries. Okay. Much more profound mysteries than Clary has presented. So this was a really horrible article. This is a horrible response. And it would be, and it's especially bad if the person who told me weeks before he published this article, if the person who told me that he was responding to this journal article knew that Clary knew about my video, then it's even worse, because he's even more to blame for not having thought about those mysteries at all and tried to make any attempt to explain them. This is just a propaganda piece. That's all it is. Okay. Let's flip the script now, and let's look at another young Earth creationist response to the same journal article. And this appears in the New Creation blog, world's largest dinosaur track site, a case study in interdisciplinary thinking. Interesting subtitle, all right? An interdisciplinary type of study, meaning we're going to be using evidence from a variety of different sources to try to investigate these fossil footprints. Maybe they're going to look a little closer at the actual observations in the paper than Dr. Clary did. Yeah, this paper is nearly the mirror image of Dr. Clary's article. All right, Christian Ryan, who's the author of this article at the New Creation blog, this was published on February 25th, 2026. It's a whole lot longer. He devotes 2,500 words to talking about this article. And right from the title, you can tell this is going to be a different kind of engagement. The very first thing that Ryan does that Clary didn't tell his readers is who made the discovery. He identifies right away Dr. Esperante as a Geoscience Research Institute paleontologist. He notes the research team included both young Earth creationists and conventional scientists, right? Some of who do, identify as atheists or agnostics. So he celebrates this collaboration as a model for how young Earth creationists can work alongside colleagues with different worldviews, right? And Christian Ryan even sent his article to that research team to be reviewed before he published it here. So Christian Ryan modeled actually interacting with the authors of this paper to get some feedback on the article that he's presenting here. So I think this transparency alone puts the article in a just completely different category from Clary's. But this isn't just about attribution, who wrote the article, who is behind it. Ryan also, I think, very accurately summarizes the geological evidence. He reports the evidence that is presented in the paper. He walks through the ostracod limestone-rich layer. He talks about the mudstones. He talks about different preservation styles of the footprints, something that I talked about, right? That there are footprints that seem to be preserved on much harder mud surfaces and others on much softer mud surfaces, suggesting different amounts of drying that had occurred before the dinosaur stepped on it. That really doesn't fit with the tsunami thing, right? Suddenly a bunch of mud's brought in, it's spread out. An hour or two later, dinosaurs walk across it. And then an hour or two later, all of a sudden it's all covered over. There's no time for differential mud densities to form and dry surfaces with mud cracks, right? No. Christian Ryan here, he talks about this stuff. He reports on these different things. He talks about the swim tracks. He talks about the worm burrows that are in the dinosaur footprint. His description of the sequence of events at the site is really good. He talks about the underwater conditions. He talks about then there's shallow water areas. He talks about subaerial exposure, right? The dinosaur activity that must have occurred, then the worm burrowing that happens, then renewed submersion again of that underneath water, which then creates more sedimentation. And then, another round of dinosaurs walking across that area, some areas. All of this is actually faithful to reporting exactly what the original paper actually reports. So he doesn't distort the evidence or just leave large chunks out. He doesn't do massive cherry picking. Timothy Clary walked up to the cherry tree and which had 100,000 cherries on it and picked out one, just really nice looking fruit that fit his profile really well. So I think Christian Ryan has given a really nice, accurate picture of what was found there. Now, Christian Ryan actually engages with my critique. He engages with my video. He quotes my argument that the site, quote, destroys flood geology. That was the title of my video, right? That the footprints destroy flood geology. And he does talk about my concerns about compartmentalization, right? The many different events that occur. And he doesn't just like straight out dismiss those. Like that Joel Duff, he's a crazy person. He provides some, I think, some thoughtful counter arguments, which we'll talk about here. Yeah. While the collaboration itself was notable, some responses to the paper focused less on the team's diversity and more on how the findings were interpreted. Then he talks about me, and he says, biologist and theistic evolutionist. That's not how Ken Ham refers to me, by the way. It's just either compromiser or evolutionist. Yeah, at the end there, he says, down there at the bottom, he further adds that this study raises uncomfortable questions about compartmentalization and what happens when the evidence simply doesn't cooperate with your theological commitments. Oh, so I forgot to say something a moment ago. I do appreciate what Christian Ryan said about the authors, too. In my video, and this is my error, I had said that, that the authors of this paper were young Earth creationists. I if I remember right, and I might not be remembering right, but I think I had a caveat in there about I wasn't sure about all the authors, but I did note that the research funding came from a young Earth creationist organization. And here, Christian Ryan is actually confirming, and I totally believe him here, that there were members of this research team that are not creationists. And so this is an interesting piece of work where you have young Earth creationists and non-young Earth creationists working together, all right, and publishing together. Okay, but back to what his response is. His basic point was this: even if this particular site is difficult to fit into a certain flood model, that doesn't automatically invalidate the entire young Earth framework. I mean, okay. He notes that there are young Earth creationists who propose that dinosaur flood fossils might reflect post-flood recolonization of the Earth rather than a flood area burial. All right, so that's one possibility, that rather than these dinosaurs being that these fossil footprints were preserved before the flood or in the flood, it could have been after the flood. Now that would require that dinosaurs were on the ark. Which young Earth creationists believe, although most young Earth creationists say that dinosaurs went extinct very soon after the ark. Like they didn't make it very far away from the ark before they keeled over or were killed by carnivores, or maybe even human beings, according to Bodhi Hodge. But they would have to travel all the way over to Bolivia, right, to make these footprints. That's a stretch, but it is an alternative hypothesis. I'll grant them that. And he argues that it is difficult to integrate this one track site into flood models. And so he says that is a reason to refine models, but not necessarily abandon them, right? I mean, he's always looking like there are other possible answers. He's definitely not just throwing out credence to the tsunami model, right? He's saying like, yeah, these are hard to explain. And that's not the approach that Timothy Clary takes. Timothy Clary takes like, oh, here's the explanation. Like answers in Genesis. Here's the answer, right? Thou shalt believe this. So I want to give credit to Ryan here. I mean, he's right. There isn't ever a single piece of evidence that destroys an interpretive framework. My whole, this destroys flood geology. Now, I think Christian Ryan probably recognizes that I am overplaying that phrase, that destroys flood geology, because that's just a common thing that some other young Earth creationists do, destroys evolution, destroys an ancient Earth, right? Very dramatic thumbnails. And so, yeah, I am kind of like mimicking that style of young Earth creationists. Notably, Christian Ryan's, publication here does not have that kind of flamboyant wording. I just realized you need something else to look at while I'm talking. So here's the side of these particular fossils. Let's give credit to Ryan here about his sort of basic methodological point, right? There's not a single piece of evidence that usually destroys an entire interpretive framework like my kind of overblown, this destroys flood geology. And so he's right to push back on my language. Science doesn't usually work by single knockout blows, but here's the thing, right? This isn't actually one piece of evidence. There's a lot more pieces of evidence here. There's a mountain of evidence that the geological record can't be compressed into a year-long catastrophe. As I mentioned before, below this particular site, below what's right behind me, are, Jurassic and Triassic and Permian rocks, all right? Thousands of feet of them. And likely there's trace fossils and other footprints in that particular material below us. And then, of course, there's lots and lots of material that was above this that had to be eroded. And there's maybe other fossils that were there at one time. All right. So all of this evidence in this entire area of this particular geological column showing different environments existing over different periods of time. That's just this one little layer of rock with 16,000 footprints in it is just, if you want to treat it as an individual piece of evidence, is just one nail, all right, in the coffin. A coffin that's already covered with, in my mind, thousands of other nails. So the most interesting part of Ryan's article, though, is the part where I think he, is trying to be thought-provoking for his audience, right? Helping people really think more deeply about the flood itself and how to understand it. He argues that many Christians, including many young earth creationists, carry around really overly simplistic pictures of the flood. The water goes all up at once, covers everything over, and then just suddenly disappears. And yeah, I think that's what a lot of young earth creationists have in mind when they think about the flood. The waters rose and they reached their pinnacle and then they fell. And Clary adds only just a tiny bit of nuance to that there are tsunamis sort of washing back and forth, bringing sediment and then moving away to other parts of the world. All right, so it's not exactly like just up and down. It's more like sloshing around. So he points to a biblical text to support what he's saying. He says that Genesis says the waters prevailed for 150 days. Right. And the Hebrew word there conveys strength and increase, prevailing. He argues that this narrative describes a progressive rise, successive recessions over a long year period, which if the world's only 6,000 years, then a year is pretty long with respect to the age of the entire earth. From this, he suggests the flood might have involved really dynamic, fluctuating environments like temporary lakes and land exposures that are there for a while and then disappear. And so, this is where the animals are situated during the times of the flood. They can wander around. They're basically looking for the next safe place to go. Ultimately, there's no safe place to go, right? Because young creationists have to acknowledge, they have to say that no animal actually eventually escaped the flood other than those in the ark, because they're the only presumed survivors. But they might have survived for a long period of time. So I think that what he's essentially saying is the evidence should cause us to refine the models, the young earth creationist models. All right. That we see, he does see evidence in this site of there was lakes here and relatively shallow, non-fast moving waters, right? Placid environment, right? We have mud that's consolidating. So this is an exposure and an environment that exists for some days and weeks at least in that year of the flood. Now, do I think that this framework actually works and really helps out a lot? No, I don't. And the reason comes back again to the specifics of the site. Multiple wetting and drying cycles, invertebrate burrows in footprints. We could go on and on. Let's not make this video go on and on. So let's not rehearse all that particular evidence. But I do want to be clear. Even though I disagree with Ryan's conclusions, Ryan's approach, right? This article's approach is fundamentally much more responsible than Clary's is. Because his audience, those who read the New Creation blog, when they get done reading this, at least this particular article, The audience is going to come away with an understanding of what was actually found at this particular location. Right? It's an accurate reporting of the findings here, the observations, the observational evidence. Right? And they're going to come away with, man, this is really challenging. We got to think as flood geologists, like, how exactly are we should we explain these observations? Ken Ham's all about observational science, right? And they're also going to come away from this article with like, yeah, there's some real questions here we don't have answers to. You don't come away with that from Clary's article. It's like, here's the answer. If you just look at it with put your flood glasses on, and suddenly everything's completely understandable. Christian Ryan's article, this is science creation done right, even when I think the underlying framework is wrong. You know, Clary's article takes a very complex, multi-layered discovery, flattens it into this really simple, cartoonish version of the story, of the flood story. He admits the creationist affiliations. He invents this tsunami scenario, even though the evidence is that it was a calm, low energy environment. He just wraps it all up with a conclusion that sounds more like a sermon than a scientific analysis. So I'm sure his audience walks away like, oh, awesome. Dinosaur footprints prove the flood happened. They don't learn that the tracks show leisurely behavior. They don't learn about the evidence of extended time. They don't learn about even the scientists who documented all this that are fellow young Earth creationists. I think there's a word for that. They've been misinformed. Ryan's article, on the other hand, presents the evidence accurately. He credits the researchers, acknowledges the difficulties for his own framework. He tries to engage constructively. Now, his audience might not end up agreeing with me, but at least they'll understand what the evidence actually shows and where the challenges lie. And that's just the night and day difference. So here's what I want young Earth creationists to notice. When you read Clary's article and then read Ryan's article, and then go look at the original paper, you're going to find out that Ryan's summary matches the paper and Clary's doesn't. That should tell you something about which source you can trust and which is going to give you the straight story. Now, I do need to acknowledge really quickly, because I think I forgot before, but I do want to acknowledge that Ryan does actually interact with some of my other critiques of this particular paper, critiques of flood geology. He actually talks about low diversity of worm burrows in the actual dinosaur footprints, talks about the absence of root structures in soil development and the possibilities of what that might mean in terms of exposure time, not being thousands of years, but possibly much shorter periods of time. Those are all possible things that need to be explored and are hypotheses that should be generated by flood geologists and investigated. So those are fair explanations. I really appreciate Ryan is engaging with the evidence rather than ignoring it. And so I don't want to ignore what he has said there, but I don't think this is also the place to sort of like try to explore those ideas much further. So where do we end up with all this, right? We've got one discovery and 3 responses, if I'm including myself, as sort of windows into how we interpret what is the observations at this site that's right behind me here. I think Ryan's new creation article, if I'm being redundant, but I think it's worth saying again, it's a case study on how to engage with difficult evidence honestly, even when it challenges your own framework. Most of his article is a challenge to himself, right, and other young Earth creationists. And I disagree with his conclusions, but I do respect his approach. I think young Earth audiences are much better served by writers like Ryan, who tell them what the evidence actually shows, even when it's uncomfortable. Now, there may be young Earth Christians who will have their faith shaken by the fact that they don't have easy, simple answers to their questions, and that making them think might actually lead them down a path that leads them away from young Earth creationism. Personally, I think that has to be a possibility, since I don't think young Earth creationism is actually correct in its understanding of Earth's history. And therefore, others will discover that, when they start questioning themselves and looking at the evidence. But nonetheless, it's still the honest thing to do with your audience. I think the young Earth audience is much better served by writers like The irony of this whole story is that the scientists most committed to young Earth are the ones whose field work, in my mind, powerfully demonstrates that the earth is old. And I think that should give all of us, right? Critics like myself and creationists, that gives us something to think about. Christian Ryan has definitely been thinking about it. And he's exploring it and putting his words out there on a blog for people to see. All right. Thanks for watching. If you found this helpful, do all that good stuff, like subscribe and like it, and share it with somebody who might benefit. I'll put links to the 2 articles that I just mentioned and my past video so that you can read them yourself. And as always, I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.